Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Fuller, the editor of the Trackside Photographer, and today we're going to be talking pictures with Scott Lothes, who is the president and executive director of the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. Welcome, Scott, and thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, Ed. It's my pleasure to be here.
Uh, for, for, for folks watching who may not be familiar with the Center for Railroad Photography and Art uh, and the mission that it has, let's start by talking about the center for a little bit. You've been there since 2008, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, the center was founded in 1997 by John Gruber. I started working part-time in 2008, full-time as executive director in 2011. So we just passed the 10-year anniversary of that this past summer. And the center's mission is to preserve and present significant images of railroading. We do that through five main core programs. We don't have a museum or gallery space of our own, so we partner with other venues where we host traveling exhibitions that we put together. We've had more than 20 of those that we've assembled. They visited over 100 different venues all over the country. We also work with partner venues on our conferences, typically one a year, sometimes two, at least in normal times. More recently, those have been online, and you can find all of them on our YouTube channel. And I think you'll have a link for that for everyone available. We also publish books and magazines. We do a quarterly journal called Railroad Heritage, which I edit, which goes out to all of our members and subscribers. And then we typically also do a book a year, and I think we'll say a little bit more about those as we go through the talk. We've got a couple of exciting projects, one just finished and another in the works right now. We also have an annual awards program with submissions currently opened for our 2022 awards program, which is called Weather Effects. And we're looking for kind of dramatic or dynamic images, really anything that kind of explores the impact of weather on railroads and railroad operations and how that all can be viewed through railroad photography. And so there are prizes and exhibitions as part of that, as well as publications. But then I think what we really do the most of these days is actually our collections. And we have an archive now of more than 500,000 images spanning the work of more than 50 different photographers, as well as a few artists. And we have a full-time archivist on staff, a reference archivist, a couple of processing archivists, and a couple of interns and volunteers all working on our collections. I think we're processing 5 different collections right now of historic images, mainly by amateur photographers, but some really talented and well-known people, as well as some lesser knowns, but also some phenomenal images. And we're putting those up on our Flickr site and sharing them through our social media channels. And in 2022, we also hope to roll out a new online collections database to make searching those easier. So there's a lot going on. Our John Gruber collection is one of our biggest projects right now, over 100,000 images in that. We're processing it chronologically, starting with the oldest. 1948 was his first picture. We're currently in 1965, and really as we're getting into the 60s, we're seeing some of John's greatest work, and those have been a lot of fun to discover, and they continue to be. And we're also working on Jim Shaughnessy's collection right now, about 90,000 images in that one, starting with some glass plates that he collected from the late 1800s and early 1900s that have been some really fun scenes of the D&H and others in upstate New York. So there's some interesting stuff in there, and of course his own work's phenomenal. And we're currently processing his Delaware and Hudson D&H photographs, and there's a lot of those, and he was really a historian on that, and got some great documentary and atmospheric shots. So it's a lot of fun, and it keeps us busy.
Yeah, I think since the start of the pandemic, the center has really done a wonderful job of compensating for your inability to hold in-person events with a wealth of virtual events on a variety of subjects. And these are available on your YouTube channel, and I'll put a link to that in the description below.
Sure, and I even have my handy little hold up sign here. We're at youtube.com/railphotoart. And I think we have about 40 different presentations on there. And we continue to try to do at least one a month. Those come over Zoom, and you can sign up for them on our website. There's no charge for those. And our next one, I think Kevin Keith will be up in December. So
Yeah, you know what many people may not know is that in addition to your role in running the center, you're also a successful writer and photographer in your own right, with hundreds of published works. So how did your interest in railroading and photography get started?
Oh, that's a great question. I grew up in West Virginia. I was born in Elkins on the Western Maryland, but then I spent most of my childhood in the southern part of the state in a town called St. Albans, just west of Charleston, the state capital, right on the Chesapeake and Ohio main line. Chessie system when I was first there, and then CSX for most of my life. So and it was interesting because the railroad there is built kind of up on a raised embankment. And so to go up and cross the tracks, most places in town, you sort of drive up and then you go over and then drive back down. So, it was almost like the trains were sort of elevated up on this pedestal. And so that was, you were always looking up at the railroad when you were walking around in St. Albans. And when I was young, the coal traffic was still quite strong. Still a double track main line there, and there's still a fair bit of coal traffic. But at the time, there's a junction in St. Albans with the Coal River branch line network that goes south of there. And so at the time, there were two sidings on either side of the main track, so a total of 6 tracks across. They had these enormous Chesapeake and Ohio cantilevered signal bridges, several in each direction for all of the junctions and crossovers and the interlocking for the branch lines there. So the railroad infrastructure was really quite impressive, and something as a small child I just couldn't help but notice and be fascinated by. And my mother and I lived on one side of the tracks. My grandparents lived on the other. So, twice a day as she would drop me off there. She was a school teacher, so she would drop me off at my grandmother's and grandfather's and then pick me up at the end of the day. And so we'd go bumping across the tracks, and I'd always be turning my head from left to right to look for headlights, and occasionally, we'd get to wait for a train. That was a great joy for me, especially when I was young and they still had cabooses on the rear, because that gave you something fun to see at the end of the train as well as the front. St. Albans has a beautiful C&O depot that's still preserved. There's a great group of volunteers there that keep it in good shape. And so that was kind of the focal point downtown. And then in the fall, we had the New River train come through with typically pulled by the Nickel Plate Road 765 Berkshire steam locomotive. And so, once my mom and grandparents found out about that, they would take me down to see it. And our summer vacations, we'd usually get at the Cass Scenic Railroad in the eastern part of the state as part of a week we'd spend at a cabin out there. So the railroad was just, such a part of my life. I always had model trains and other things growing up. And I always had a creative streak. I loved to draw, and my mom would bring home these big rolls of paper from school. And my grandparents' house had these wooden steps that were probably 5 or 6 feet wide, leading from their kitchen down to the den. There were only 3 of them there. And my grandfather built them himself and varnished them, so it was a nice, flat, smooth, long, straight surface. And so I'd unroll these sheets of paper all the way across them and draw trains in profile. And I used to throw temper tantrums because I couldn't get the wheels to be round until someone showed me that I could trace nickels and dimes and quarters, and then I was happy after that. So the railroad was just such a part of my life growing up, and I love drawing and trying to relate to it visually. I took some art classes in high school when my schedule around all the math and science and literature classes would allow. And I really enjoyed that too. And I tried to keep drawing in college. I went to school at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland for mechanical engineering, and was quite busy with classes there, and didn't have a lot of time for drawing, and was to a point where I felt like I could do a reasonable job on the technical parts of the drawings, but the scenery and the nature and the natural parts were really challenging for me. And it was about that time I met a friend who was into not only trains, but also photography. And that was kind of a revelation to me that there was this group of people that, that really went out and photographed railroads very intentionally. And so I got my first serious camera, a Canon digital, or still film at that time, Canon SLR, I think my junior year of college. When I was 20, and photography's just kind of become an increasingly big part of my life. It kind of filled that gap that had been left behind by not drawing as much, and allowed me to finally be able to document to depict the natural elements in addition to the technological ones.
So your photography grew out of your interest in railroads, but I'm wondering what percentage of the photography that you do now is railroad related as opposed to just general things?
Well, I'd say the majority of it is. I mean, unless you want to count my iPhone snapshots of my dog, which might be my most prolific current output. The railroad for me it's such a complex and far-reaching institution. To the point that I really feel like it's kind of the lens through which I view a lot of the world. And I've been asked before, by friends that are whose interests are a little bit more general and maybe not as specific as the railroad, if I ever might run out of interest in it. And I've always just kind of said no, because it feels like even if you might exhaust one path of interest within railroading, there's just so many different paths to pursue. It's just such a deep and far-reaching subject that touches history and geography and culture and technology and art and just labor relations and economics and just on and on and on. So to me, it's kind of that again, that lens through which I view the world, or at least a lot of it. And there's ways to traveling internationally, you can see how different countries use the railroad, and there's interesting things to be observed through doing that. And so I tend to be a pretty intentional photographer. I do a lot of planning ahead of my trips. And so, and I think also because I work in archives, I realize that if you're going to take a photograph, you're going to want to be able to preserve it and do something with it. And this might be a limitation sometimes, but I'm just not as prone to go out and photograph things unless I have a real kind of clear intention for what I want to do with those photographs at some point, at least, whether it's a subject of particular interest or some other project. So I tend to take kind of an intentional project focused approach to my photography. And so, the vast majority of the intentional photography I do is rail related to some extent. Not necessarily just trains going by, although I certainly enjoy that a great deal, but something that shows the connections of railroads to the landscape and to the people, and it's kind of interpreting those topics that I'm most interested in exploring as a photographer.
I think as in looking through the photographs that we're going to be looking at here in a few minutes, I think that sense of of the connection in your work between the railroad and the landscape and the culture comes through very, very strongly. You're not just a trained photographer, so to speak.
Yeah, and I mean, I think certainly trains are kind of my first love there, and again, growing up with the New River train and Cass, steam locomotives are kind of foremost. But for whatever reason, I've never had as great of an interest in photographing tourist or museum operations. I certainly enjoy them when I see them, and I enjoy others' work. But for me, I really enjoy the kind of the railroad in the here and now and what it means to our current economy and the bigger parts of our culture that it touches, and how we as photographers and artists continue to interpret it, whether it's people from within kind of the railroad enthusiast community or from outside it. It's always interesting for me to see people who might not have that direct enthusiast interest in trains still approaching it in art or other media, and how that comes out. So that's fascinating to me, and I just the railroad story in the United States and in so many places is a landscape story. I mean, here we kind of reoriented our nation from this, north-south kind of waterborne, animal-powered economy before the Civil War into this, east-west nation tied together in large part by steel rails in the latter part of the 19th century following the Civil War. So, I mean, railroads, I think, are just part and parcel with our identity, and particularly in their in their abilities to cross landscapes, but also in the way that the landscapes can limit that. And so it's looking at how railroads have sort of, threaded their way through the mountain passes and across the plains and other geographic barriers is just fascinating for me, and something I try to touch on in my photography, and something I enjoy seeing in other people's work.
Well, I think the center is very fortunate to have you, because you're not only uh, a good administrator and communicator for the center, but you also bring your passion for railroading and photography along, and I think it works very well. Shall we look at some pictures?
Let's do it.
All right, the first picture is from the center's collection, and Furler's work is also the subject of a book published by the center.
Yeah, that's right. So we received the photography collection of Donald W. Furler in 2017 as a gift from his son Alan. And Don Furler was he started out as someone who was mainly interested in taking engine pictures, and this was a trend that was quite popular in the 1920s and 30s of a lot of railroad enthusiasts who did these some kind of three-quarter or broadside views of locomotives, kind of taking portraits of locomotives, that they would often then make prints of and trade almost like baseball cards. And so there was this kind of taxonomic approach to trying to get, all of the locomotives of a certain railroad of a specific class. And so this was kind of the genesis of a lot of rail enthusiast photography in the US, and I think in some other countries too. But as cameras got better and as I think more photographers got interested in approaching the railroads in different ways, there was kind of this urge, I think, to go out and make photographs showing these engines in action. And this is what we have in this photograph, a really fine example of that, of one of many of Don Furler's photographs that I just love. And he did most of his work on medium and large format cameras, started out doing his action shots on a Graflex folding camera, upgraded to a 4x5 speed graphic. And then because he wanted even larger negatives than that, a 5x7 speed graphic, which he used for most of his railroad action photography. And this picture we have here from the Delaware and Hudson of one of their big Challenger locomotives leading a symbol freight north. This is in Pennsylvania, just south of the New York state line, near Lanesboro, Pennsylvania, where the Delaware and Hudson crosses under the Erie Railroad's spectacular Storaka Viaduct. But Don really liked these places where he could get out and have a long view of the train. You can see it disappearing off into the vanishing point there, and kind of in this very classical 3/4 view. And so this is kind of the aesthetic that is representative of these early action shots in railroad photography. But I think this one's a really particularly stunning example. We have these really dramatic winter clouds with kind of this leaden approach that kind of mimic the patterns that you see in the smoke and the steam from the locomotive. And then I just love the tonality of the winter landscape here, particularly those bare trees over on the right and how they're offset against the ground and then the mountain in the background. And that mountain is also an interesting example because if you look about 1/3 to 1/2 the way up it, you can see a line that kind of runs horizontally across the trees. And that's actually the right-of-way of the Erie Railroad's main line, which again crossed over the D&H at Storaka Viaduct in Lanesboro, Pennsylvania. And it's a great example of kind of how there's more than meets the eye initially to some of these action pictures. And again, Don was a master at taking them. I mean, they're sharp. They have incredible depth of field, perfectly exposed, and he really knew where to go for these kind of dramatic smoke scenes with the engines working hard. And so this is, I think, just a great example of kind of where a lot of railroad action photography in the United States started from. And it's a collection I'm really glad that we have. We actually published a book, as you said, which I authored. And it was just great fun going through this collection, and also a great way for me to get to know the Northeast and its railroads a little bit better. In those days, right around World War II and before the so much of the industrial retrenchment that happened there and kind of the deindustrialization of the Northeast. So I mean, this was kind of these photographs sort of show the end of that era, not just for the railroads, but for kind of that whole manufacturing and industrial character of the Northeast as it was. And so it's, I think, just a great kind of snapshot of a moment in time is preserved in these photographs.
You'd mentioned that the early photographers were interested in the locomotives, and I would suggest that the locomotives were probably a lot more interesting back then than they are now. So,
well, absolutely. No, that's a great point. I mean, there were several, large locomotive manufacturers, Lima, Baldwin, Alco kind of being the big three. And a lot of these engines were built to similar specifications, but at that point, really all of these engines were kind of their own creatures, and they took on their own identities as they were maintained and upgraded, and different details were switched out. And steam locomotives just have so much character in themselves. They required a lot of maintenance, a lot of hands-on specialized work that I think a lot of the workers probably enjoyed. It was hard work, to be sure, but I think it was something that people took a lot of pride in, both the maintenance and the operation. And of course, with so many technologies, as things move forward, things become more, more homogenized, more standardized, and that certainly happened in the railroads. And so when this was a time when, really all of these engines were kind of, their own kind of works of art, or at least, of great craftsmanship. And now we have very, very efficient, successful mass-produced diesel electric locomotives. but they lack some of the individual character that these engines had, and certainly they lack the drama of the big clouds of smoke and steam, and some of the fussiness of maintaining these engines. And so that's something that's changed greatly, and that photographers have had to react to if they wanted to keep finding interesting ways of photographing railroads.
Now, the rest of the photos that we're going to be looking at are from your own body of work. Tell us about this moody and almost abstract image.
So this is one of my all-time favorite photographs that I've taken. It's of a place very near and dear to my heart of my childhood. This is the New River Gorge in southern West Virginia, now our newest national park in the United States. And we're looking down from a place called Diamond Point at some of the rapids in the rivers there, the New River just east of Fayetteville, West Virginia. And the lights you see at the lower left are the lights of a westbound empty hopper train coming towards you on main track number 1. Main track number 2, which carries most of the eastbound trains, is kind of hidden in the shadows on the other side of the river. The tracks were split or still are split for 8 miles through the gorge here. And that was done by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway because they had coal mines and mining towns on both sides of the river that their trains served. And so it's a really dramatic landscape, but it's one that's difficult to photograph in kind of the traditional conventions of railroad photography. If you go someplace that you can get up close to the trains, I think you just lose so much of what makes the landscape here special. As you can see here, if you pull back, the trains become very small. And so, you need to still, if you want to highlight the railroad, you need some dramatic light or some way of still being able to show its presence when it's, so small compared to the rest of the scene. And I was just incredibly fortunate here. This was October of 2007. And every year, at least in non-COVID times, the New River Gorge, if you've seen any pictures of it, you've probably seen the big arched bridge that is kind of an emblem of West Virginia. It appears on their quarter. And this was well, at the time it was built, it was the largest single arch bridge in the world. I think it's still the largest in the Western Hemisphere. And it was opened in October of 1977, close to the third Saturday of October. And so now the third Saturday of every year, they close half of the bridge down. It's a 4-lane bridge, so they divert all the traffic to one side. And on the other side, people can walk out on it and look down into the bridge. And then they have rappellers and base jumpers that are actually jumping off of the bridge and parachuting down to the river below. So it's this big spectacle of outdoor enthusiast sports. And so I'd gone for it this year to see it, and also just to be there in my favorite time of year in the fall. And so I'd been there the day before, and I'd camped down by the river at Sewell and photographed trains crossing one of the bridges that night. And then I'd woken up, early, way before daybreak, and driven up here to the top of the gorge. I did the 1.5 mile hike out to this spot of Diamond Point before, in the pitch black darkness. And when I got out there, the light was just coming into the sky, and there was this river of fog, these, low clouds that were just flowing down the river, almost, in kind of a match to the river's flow. And this is not a particularly busy railroad. Even then, it was maybe 15 or 20 trains in a 24-hour period at best. And so I had no expectation of seeing a train here. I just wanted to be out there at that magical time of sunrise. And so I started taking photographs of the fog rolling down the river. And as the sun was coming up and the sky was getting brighter, it started to kiss the cloud tops a little bit with this very subtle pink pastel light. And as this was happening, all of a sudden I hear this westbound train approaching. And it was just, one of these rare moments when all the conditions align perfectly. And, it's a case where you don't need a lot to show that the train is there. I mean, we have the headlights and they're reflecting off the steel rails. And even though it's a small part of the picture, you know exactly what it is. And so I think it's, it's a great way of being able to put the railroad into the context of the bigger landscape here. And still, I think, in a way that captures some of the mystery and the intrigue and the allure of the New River Gorge. So it's, it's a lucky photograph, but it's of a very special place. And so it's really dear to my heart.
It's a photograph that I think invites the viewer to spend some time with it. It's not something you're going to get in a quick glance, but as you look at it, your time spent looking at this photograph is richly rewarded, I think.
My good friend Kevin Scanlon from Pittsburgh, a photography mentor of mine who spent countless days and weeks in the New River Gorge himself, described a morning that he was on another of these overlooks looking down into the gorge, and as the sun was coming up again, there was fog, and the fog was kind of lifting up and burning off as the sun came up. And Kevin kind of related that to all those little mining towns that used to be there that are now gone. As the mines played out, the mines closed, these towns went away, the people who lived there went away, and it was almost like the fog was the ghosts of these old mining towns burning off into the endless tapestry of time.
This photograph was included in the recently published book, The Railroad and the Art of Place, and an anthology. So tell us a little bit about this photo.
So this is, yeah, so this was a project that you were also a part of, Ed, with your beautiful afterword that's kind of a coda for this
Thank
book
you.
called True Places. No, it's really, really beautiful summary of the project.
Yeah, I was real honored to be part of that.
Well, we're honored to have you in it. Um, and this was conceived by one of our board members, David Kaler, who has a real passion. He's an architect, or had his long, successful career as an architect in Milwaukee, part of the Kaler Slater firm, founder of that firm, that did some fantastic work in Milwaukee and also here in Madison, where the center is located. And so David is, kind of someone who takes an artistic view of kind of everything he approaches in the world, including photography and railroads. And he's really interested in the interactions of railroads with kind of everyday places in the built environment, places that we might not necessarily think of as being great attractions, but places that are very important to kind of the fabric of our lives. And so I think those are kind of part of the aesthetic vision that he's tried to espouse at the center in what we call the railroad and the art of place. And so in this book, we realize that there's actually a lot of photographers doing work along these lines. That's maybe a little bit more contemplative in nature. We don't necessarily have, dramatic shots of trains bearing down on us. But there are, again, photographs that as you look at them, hopefully there's a bit more to see. And I say hopefully, but in reference to my own work, and I think certainly in the other photographers' work I see there, it just becomes more interesting to me the more time I spend with it. And so one of the sections in that book looks at the old switching districts of Portland, Oregon. And the author for that essay is another good friend of mine, Alexander Craighead, also deeply involved in this book. And he's really made a life's project of documenting these switching districts, their history, and their remnants. And this is a spot that was still active when I photographed it in 2009. We're looking west down Hoyt Street. And at the very end of this, you can see a square building there with a little bit of steam coming from the top of it. And that's a foundry for a company called ESCO. And they were making cast metal parts there. And so they'd occasionally receive a covered hopper of sand that the Portland Terminal Company delivered from their nearby lake yard, typically using BNSF power. I always wanted to see that happen. I never did, but it was still just a fascinating place to go and kind of contemplate the relationship between the railroads and the city. Portland's a city that really kind of started as a mill town, a lumber town, and a grain town with a really deep kind of rich industrial fabric and tradition. And it's a city that's, grown up now around electronics and healthcare and very much a part of the kind of the new economy. And so this was a place that you could still see a little bit of that old industrial past that at the time was still active. This foundry has since closed. I believe the tracks are still there, but there's a brand new storage facility that's been built on the right side of the image here. And so even in the time since I've been there, this place has changed greatly. But it was just such a fascinating place. And I mean, you can see there's a diamond in the middle of the street here. And that was where two of these switching lines crossed one another at grade. You can see the remnants of a switch just beyond us that would have served, I think, some warehouses off to the right. And so all this happened in the middle of the streets. And it was just fascinating to me, and fascinating that it was still there and that it was still in use. And even though I never caught that longed for train here, it was still just a really interesting place, and a place that I thought was interesting for photography. And so I tried to approach it as much as I could. Several other places in Portland that still had some of this old industrial character that were in the time. I spent about 3.5 years in the Northwest, and so I really enjoyed photographing the kind of the more traditional natural landscapes like the Columbia Gorge and the Cascade Mountains. But really was surprised at how much I enjoyed exploring these old industrial neighborhoods of Portland and the remnants of their railroad past, and how that was still at least a little speck of the present here.
Well, Scott, you had a really spectacular viewpoint here, and I think it's a testament to your international influence that the Swiss provided you with a train painted just the perfect color to go with that landscape.
Well, red is my favorite color, and the Swiss have been very kind to paint many of their trains that color for me. Uh, but no, in all seriousness, I early on, I really focused most of my interest domestically, but I had the great good fortune first with my wife to go to Asia and teach English in Japan, which really kind of opened my eyes to the interest of the wider world. And then a few years ago, I was kind of in a photographic funk, and I just for whatever reason wasn't terribly inspired to get out around here. And we have a wonderful board of directors at the center, and they've always been very supportive of not only my leadership there, but of my own creative interests and output. And so they were kind enough, after I'd been there 5 years, they granted me a sabbatical where I was able to spend a few weeks traveling in Europe and experiencing its railways, and my wife was able to join me for part of that. But that really kind of ignited a passion, and I've been able to go back a few times, again, very fortunately so. And in Switzerland, I found just an endlessly fascinating mountain railroad landscape. And so this is on my favorite little meter gauge system there called the Rhaetian Railway in the southeastern part of Switzerland in the canton of Graubünden, near both borders Italy and Austria, as well as Liechtenstein. And so this is on their line that goes down the Inn River towards the Austrian border. And it's the spectacular gorge. And one of the many things I love about Switzerland is that there are hiking trails everywhere. And I enjoy driving around looking for trains and places to photograph them here. But what I really love is getting out and hiking. And in Switzerland, you can ride the trains and get off and hike, and then just explore these really magical mountain landscapes so that have these beautiful trains running through them. And so in this part, it's about a 6-mile round trip hike, or a one-way hike. You start in a little town called Sinuas and you can hike north about 6 miles to Zernez, and you're following this gorge of the Inn River almost the whole way. And there's a couple of these places where the tracks go through long tunnels and cross a stone arch bridge in these little short spaces in between. And so I was able to hike out and find a vantage point here. And it really, I think, kind of shows some of my photographic preferences. Maybe it's a little bit predictable with me now at this point, but I really love these wide angle views that have a lot of complexity going on in the scene. I was drawn to these gnarly old tree roots here in the foreground, and then there's that pine tree that lands just almost precisely in the middle of the frame, kind of splitting it in half, with the gorge of the Inn River on the right, and then the viaduct of the railroad on the left. And again, the railroad doesn't necessarily need to be a large part of my photographs to be interesting to me. And certainly it's easy for the trains to be small when they're this beautiful bright red color that really pops against the rest of the natural landscape.
This is a wonderful portrait, Scott. Lou looks really relaxed and at home in the cab, and the way his body leans into the frame from the far right-hand edge seems to invite us to share the cab with him.
So I should confess up front, I don't do a lot of people photography, and it's not because I don't enjoy it, but I'm shy by nature, and the best, most successful I have been at photographing people is in places when those people have been very comfortable with me and with me being there. And so Lou retired a couple of years ago as an engineer with the Portland and Western Railroad out in Oregon. And again, while I was living there, I was able to do a story about their locomotive shops for Kalmbach's annual publication called Locomotive Magazine. And Lou was someone I'd already got to know. He's also a photographer and attended some of the railroad group meetings out there. And so, having, now this official blessing to be able to photograph him on the job, he was, I think, more than happy to accommodate me in any way that he could. And at the time, he was the yard engineer here in the former Southern Pacific Yards in Albany. He's in the cab of one of SP's venerable old SD7 locomotives, the 1501, built in 1952, and kind of the standard yard power there for the Portland and Western. And Lou, you know, as you can see, I mean, he does have the more modern gloves and rain jacket on against that ever-present northwestern drizzle. But underneath them, he's still got his traditional bib overalls and even a chain from, I think, a watch there hanging in his front vest pocket. So, you know, Lou was someone who definitely had a deep appreciation for the traditions of railroading, and you know, was someone who just took a tremendous amount of pride in his work. And you know, thanks to the strength of our relationship and our friendship and his respect of me as a photographer, you know, this was one of those situations where I was very much at ease. He was very much at ease with me being there. And so that's, for me, is just a really great environment to be able to do photography in. And I'm just, you know, I'm really pleased that I was able to capture this view of him, you know, in his steed there in the Albany Yards. And it's one that's actually going to appear in the Center's next book, which we're going to be publishing in 2022. It's called Continuity and Change, The Lure of North America's Railroads. And it really kind of looks at that dynamic between the things in railroading that resist change and the great changes that have swept through the industry. And so, you know, Lou is definitely someone who very much was, you know, an engineer of the 21st century, you know, but through his dress and his deep knowledge and, you know, his great respect for his craft, someone who preserves some of those traditions as well. And so we have one chapter that looks at workers in specific, and then other chapters look at landscapes and commerce and passenger travel and some of the other things going on in the industry and how photographers are approaching them today.
I believe you said this was a drone shot. Tell us about this.
Well, so after several years of resisting, I got my first drone for Christmas in 2019, and well, I kind of, in spite of myself, really took to it. And living here in the Midwest, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from West Virginia originally, so I'm a child of the mountains, but we don't have those big overlooks like we do in the New River Gorge that we can hike out to as easily, although the Mississippi River does provide some. And the Mississippi has kind of been my playground and my greatest you know, photographic pursuit since moving here. But you know, over the past, well, 10 years now, I've spent a lot of time photographing it, and it, you know, felt that I'd kind of exhausted a lot of the ideas I had from at least the ground-based angles there. But the drone really changed my perspective and opened up a lot of places and angles that you just can't get otherwise. And this is a great example. This is in Hannibal, Missouri, Mark Twain's hometown. And this is a place where, this is a Norfolk Southern line now, former Wabash, where the Wabash crosses the river, then crosses a Burlington line at grade, and then goes through this tunnel in the bluff, comes out, makes a 90-degree curve to come up parallel to the Burlington, just to the south of here through town. So it's a spectacular railroad location, but it's not, and it's, you know, completely unexpected in the Midwest. I mean, you would expect something like that to happen in Colorado or Montana, but, you know, not in Missouri or Illinois. And there's another place almost exactly like this in East Dubuque, Illinois, where the Canadian Nationals, former Illinois Central, crosses the BNSF main line at grade and then crosses the Mississippi River into Dubuque, Iowa in that case. And in both of these cases, it's just very difficult to show any sense of what a spectacular location this is from the ground. And you can see here, I mean, the trees are grown up very thick. You know, this is a very nice park in Hannibal. You can see above the tunnel the road for the park where I was came in on and launched my drone from. And so it's just really excited to be able to have this view. You can't see the BNSF line from here, but you can see the bridge in the background and the train popping out of the tunnel in between all of the trees there, the river in the background, the grain elevator beyond it. So it really shows a lot of this you know, kind of stunning river bluff landscape of the upper Mississippi here in the Midwest. And I think it's a great example of some of the new angles that drones have opened up for railroad photographers, and something I really continue to enjoy exploring. And boy, there's just a lot of really talented photographers doing some really great drone work out there. We had one of our recent online presentations, Jennifer Albeck from up in New England, who's doing some phenomenal drone work and otherwise on the railroads up there. So it's a lot of fun, and for me, it's kind of re-energized me to get out and kind of re-examine the railroads in my own backyard now that I have this new way of looking at them.
There's this reminds me, there in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the train crosses the river there and goes and tunnels under the bluff in much the same way. This reminds me of that.
No, that's on the Kansas City Southern,
Yes,
and
it is.
a place I've not gotten to and one I'd very much like to, maybe before their merger with the Canadian Pacific is
It's
finalized.
finalized. Yeah.
I've really, as I said, I've made a project of the Mississippi River and have photographed all of the active bridges between the Twin Cities and St. Louis, and even the next one south of there at Thebes. So I think there's still 6 more beyond there, including the one at Vicksburg. And so one of these days, I'd kind of like to just make a trip down to New Orleans, kind of close the loop on the Mississippi. But I do want to say one other thing about drones before we move on from this one, and that for me is the one frustration of them, and that's that you know I spend so much of my life looking at screens and electronic devices. And of course, to shoot with a drone, what do? Well, I look at a screen on my electronic device. And I miss being there. I mean, I love the angles that I can get, but, I'm not the one up there in the sky looking down on that. It's my little flying electronic camera. And so, as much as I enjoy the drones, it's another tool in the toolbox, another lens in the camera bag. And I still love, getting out and seeing things with my own eyes and climbing to the vantage points myself when I can. But when I can't, I'm sure glad to be able to send up the drone to do it.
Yeah, the camera always inserts itself between us and what we're looking at anyway. And with the drone, you've got a double amount of separation, it seems to me.
No, that's well said, and I think a good analogy. Again, it's pros and cons, but I think that's the case for so much of the technology in railroading and photography both.
Scott, I know this is a busy time of year for everyone, and I know the center really keeps you busy. So I appreciate very much you being with us today. It's been great talking to you.
Oh, Ed, it's my pleasure, and I really have enjoyed the conversation, and enjoy everything I get to do with railroads and photography and the center and everything else. So it's great fun to sit down and talk about it, and I thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed our talk today. And I'd like to encourage our viewers, if you're not familiar with the Center for Railroad Photography and Art and the wonderful work that they do, please take time to check out their website. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Thanks for watching.
Thanks a lot.